The Sex and the City philosophy on men is, well, pretty simple. Let's have a listen.
With the right match, it's fate.
It's not fate. His light is on, that's all.
What light?
Men are like cabs. When they're available, their light goes on. They wake up one day and they decide they're ready to settle down, have babies, whatever, and they turn their light on. The next woman they pick up, boom, that's the one they'll marry. It's not fate. It's dumb luck.
I'm sorry. I refuse to believe that love is at random.
Please, it's all about timing. You gotta get them when their light's on.
Most men I meet are flashing yellows.
Or off duty. They can drive around for years picking up women and not be available.
Then they really shouldn't be allowed to get behind the wheel.
Most men don't stay lit long before they take the plunge, versus most women who've been lit pretty much since birth.
By the way, if that was the other way around, there would be blue murder. But nonetheless, are they way off the mark, or maybe have they hit the nail on the head when it comes to summing up the mating habits of the Irish man? Well, Dr. Paul Ryan, an assistant lecturer in sociology at NUI Maynooth, has been giving this a lot of thought. Paul, you're welcome to the programme.
Hi, Will. How are you?
Very well, thank you. So is the philosophy spot on?
Yeah, I mean, the study that I was looking at was a historical study. We were looking at 1963 up to 1980, and the Sex and the City quote is more kind of contemporary what is happening today, but it seems to be pretty much the same. I mean, I was looking at kind of this transition from the 60s, and when our society was supposed to be getting also more modern, and we were less concerned about what families thought, we were less concerned about inheritance of farms and all of this, but it turns out that love is kind of further down the line in terms of the men that I was interviewing in relation to this.
Well, there is the age-old Irish way of proposing, which often comes up for ridicule. How would you like to be buried with my people? Things like that have had their day and have moved on. But in your study, you were looking at, say, in 1963, what sort of factors determined when people tied the knot?
Well, some things changed as we went into the 60s. Some things really stayed the same. So that's what I'm saying. For example, the issue around kind of farming. In the 60s, you would think this became less important. The issue of dowries, for example, was dying out. But still, for farmers, they were still picking a woman that they thought their parents would like. So basically, that man was actually picking a woman for 3 people instead of 1, which made it much more complicated. So they were kind of saying, look, I know the sort of woman that my parents would like. And often that woman would have to, if he was inheriting the farm, that woman would actually have to come into the house.
And would it just be farmers who were Mammy's boys?
Not just farmers, but it was certainly more kind of present in that. There was certainly family influence did play an impact on the type of women that men chose. So a word from, for example, there was one man we interviewed who was dating this woman. He was engaged. He was for 4 years, and this woman was older than he was, maybe 4 years, I think 4 or 5 years. And his mother kind of then suggested, well, maybe she's just a little bit too old for you. And there you go. The relationship ended.
Boom, Mammy spoke, and that's it.
Done.
The study is entitled How I Met Your Mother, Exploring Changes in Mate Selection in the Lives of Irish Men 1963 to 1980. It all sounds very Klingon, I take you as my mate.
It is, and I suppose it's putting forward a very rational kind of approach, that people approach this very rationally as opposed to approaching it from the heart. And of course, as we go in, as I'm saying, 60s, 70s, and right up to now, there is this idea, this sort of heroic concept of love. Every media, movies, the whole romantic comedy genre and film, it's all about, love at first sight, boom, this kind of story. But again, even then and now, that really doesn't seem to be the case, and that goes to the issue of timing. There, when you play the Sex and the City clip, certainly the men that I interviewed, it got to a stage where they dated. Sometimes they were engaged, but they weren't interested in marriage, often because they weren't economically in a good position, so they wouldn't consider it. And then suddenly they kind of think, I'm actually at the age now that I should do this and settle down. And whichever woman they were dating at that time, again, boom, that's the woman.
Well, that's interesting, because the widely held assumption would be that, be it for men or for women, you go around and you hope to meet Mr. or Mrs. Right, and you will get into all sorts of relationships before that person eventually comes along, if they come along, and that those relationships crumble because the person simply isn't compatible with you. But what you're saying is that you could meet the wrong person at the right time and still get married.
Well, yeah, and you might think that they were the right person, maybe they were the right person at that time, but they may have also been seeing women prior to that who were also right and compatible, but they weren't married. It was never going to kind of end in marriage, I suppose, for them. It's funny you mentioned the issue of compatibility. And as we go into the 60s and 70s, this becomes a kind of a much more important, and particularly sexual compatibility. So the idea that, the sexual component got much more important for happy marriage. And both men and women were concerned that whoever they met, that there would be this type of compatibility. And what that led to is longer courtships, for example. This is this concept of going steady. So before, the trend was that people would meet and marry maybe within 12, 13 months. Again, in the 60s and 70s, in my study, a lot of them were engaged for 4 years, 5 years, 6 years.
It seems almost unimaginable, though, that there was a time when sex didn't really matter, because there's so much emphasis on it now. And the impression almost is that in the 50s or in the 40s or the 30s or whenever, that sex was merely a function to create children, as opposed to being an integral part of the relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was the case. And because a lot of these couples weren't having sex before marriage, there really was no chance or opportunity to test that compatibility until they got into the honeymoon bed. And but interestingly, you say that. In contemporary research on this will show also that sexual compatibility is very, very important. And couples will say that in that research that that you're either sexually compatible or you're not. That sex is actually not something that can be improved over time. You either do it, and if it's not good, then it's over if you don't do it again.
That's, again, fascinating, because there is the perception that you could go out and read the Kama Sutra X number of times, or buy some dirty videos, or introduce toys or whatever, and that will all spice it up. But what you're finding is that if the spark isn't there to begin with, doesn't matter how much gas you put in the room.
Well, certainly, yeah, and certainly in terms of the research on this, that's what people would report. But you're absolutely right on the whole technical side. And again, as we go into the 60s and 70s, and a lot of this was coming from the US and the UK, there was increased emphasis on, getting it right technically. So, for example, for married women, we find issues of orgasm within sex almost unknown. And then women, because of reduction in censorship, women are reading about this, and that all becomes much more important. So you're right, there is a technical side which they also wanted became more important.
Women are becoming more demanding then?
Well, I think then as a now, I think when I'm looking at men, I was interviewing men, but the reality was in the 60s and 70s that this notion of the woman waiting in the dance hall, waiting for the man to come over and ask her, that was really dying out. The position of women was changing. Women were much more assertive in terms of going and getting what they want, approaching men, talking to men, initiating sex with men. A lot of the men that I spoke to, not a lot, a number of them said that they went out with women who they thought were too sexually forward for them.
Well, I wonder then to what extent confidence plays a part in the man turning on the light, so to speak, and declaring that he's ready. Because whether it's financial matters, being secure financially, or maybe just generally having that aura of confidence or that life experience that you're able to handle a relationship, all of its facets, I wonder if that's why men are waiting that bit longer.
I think there is an element of that. I think in my study, a lot of that confidence was coming from what people were reading in the media, for example, and there was so much more about relationships, and as I said, this concept of longer engagements, so people were kind of exploring maybe a little bit more about what they wanted, and were thinking about what they wanted more before they made this plunge into marriage, which was, at that time, pretty much for life.
Okay, so for the woman listening to this who is with a man whose light doesn't appear to be on, he is not popping the question, he's not down on one knee, is there anything she can do to flick the switch?
Well, now, I have to say, in terms of contemporary, in the contemporary era, I have to say, there's a lot of women that don't necessarily want that light to go on, that they may be actually, again, this kind of perception that women that are in relationships of 3 or 4 years are desperately waiting for this kind of question to be popped. I think that's kind of a bit inaccurate. I think a lot of women are in relationships and decisions are made mutually as to their future, be it that, I think, marriage or not. But I think in terms of children and maybe an expectation of having children, I think the man should, men would obviously be more, women are more sensitive to this than men, I suppose.
Well, it's interesting, even in my own case, I only recently got engaged. And Alex and I had reached an understanding, shall we say, maybe even 2 years ago, and it was just a matter of me getting the finger out and buying the ring.
Okay.
But when it comes to kids, that is a bigger decision, and that's when all sorts of life factors kick in. The matter of money, stability, job security, where you're living.
Absolutely.
And in your study, what was it, or at what age maybe is maybe the better question, when did men tend to become ready?
Well, we know, again, from the statistics, we know, in my study, for example, in the 60s, that the age of marriage dropped. So men were actually getting married. In the 60s, more people were getting married because we'd left the austerity of the 1950s and we had the prosperity in the 1960s. So we have a big spike in the amount of those that got married. And the age of those people got declined. And again, that has a lot to do with kind of rural Ireland, I suppose, and that there was more economic opportunities for men. And so people were freer to marry earlier.
And how did that develop then through to the 80s?
Well, generally generally in recessions, and we're going through a period now which is kind of defying that logic. But generally during recessions, people delay marriage and people delay having children. What we find now currently is that during the current recession, there's still marriage is still incredibly popular, and we're still having more children. That hasn't declined at all. So,
but it's interesting. Yet again, we come back to the finances.
Yeah, well, this is it. Whatever about the pessimism we have about the economy, it would seem in this regard that, on the intimate level, that couples do seem optimistic about choosing to have children at a time when the economic clouds are hovering.
But Irish men are obsessed about money. Is that the conclusion we can draw finally?
I think money is certainly important. I don't know if that's unique to Irish men, but certainly I think that issue and stability is important, yeah.
All right. Dr. Paul Ryan, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for taking our call today.
Okay, thanks, Phil.
Dr. Ryan is an assistant lecturer in sociology at NUI Maynooth. Well, would you agree with that, whether you're a man or a woman? Is it unfair to men to say that they are like taxis, that sooner or later they will switch their light on, but don't bother approaching them if they are saying they're unavailable? Because you can be in a perfectly happy relationship, but ladies, that ring just won't materialise. Or is it all a load of cobblers? 0818 300 103 is our